All right, welcome back to Chapter 16, Part 2, and now we're talking about the Second Urban Revolution, or very closely related to the Industrial Revolution. So, the Industrial Revolution we've talked about in class a few times, and with the rise of the industrial society comes the industrial city. And a way to kind of think, what is this? The Industrial Revolution is where the factory, the center of production, shifts from the home to the factory. So, for instance, we had woven cloth before the 1800s, but people wove cloth in their own homes. And if you're doing it in your own home, it's on a small scale. With the Industrial Revolution, we have factories where we mechanize this. Instead of one family making all their cloth, you have a factory making thousands of yards of cloth for the whole city. Okay? And in this urban revolution and this urbanization phase, industry becomes the dominant economic activity, and the cities are organized around that. So what happens is urbanization begins to really rise. It had been rising slowly till about the 1800s, and with the rise of the factory city, all of a sudden populations just skyrocketed. In Great Britain, if you look at this map, this is a population density map, and what it shows you is the darker the red, the more people live in that area. So you can see it's very dense populated around London. This is in the year 1801, by the way, but very not so much dense here in the north and in the west. So in 1801, 70% of the population, so the vast majority, lived in places, small towns or villages where the population was less than 2,500, so very tiny. But by 1840, look at the difference. By 1840, almost half the population lives in cities of more than 1,000 people. So they completely flipped, and now most people live in large cities. And look at the population density here. It just dramatically increases right here in the middle, in what they call this the Midlands. And this was one of the first areas of industrialization. Some of the first large factory towns are right here. Okay. With the rise of the urban city and huge populations of factory workers, we start to see the idea of class struggle. This is where we start for the first time seeing the idea of labor being the people who are making the goods and capital, the people who own the factories. And so we start seeing this. In fact, Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto and starts this idea of communism, was actually agitating for workers' rights in England in the 1880s. And what they did was, in a lot of these cities, a lot of people working in factories were making almost no money. They were working 6 days a week, maybe 75, 80 hours a week, and making just enough to get by. They were living with their families in these 1 and 2 room homes in the city, just packed in cheek and jowl. Very horrible conditions. I mean, they were slums worse than we can imagine today. And so these writers like Karl Marx saw that and said that, improvements need to be made. People need to be paid more. They need to be given access to clean and fresh water, healthcare, education. And if this doesn't happen, then people who are at the bottom of society who are being exploited might get so sick of it, there could be a revolution. And it's happened. It happened in Russia. It's happened in China. People actually have had communist revolutions. Today we're currently in the third urban revolution. And what marks this is that it is truly global. It doesn't just apply to industrial nations. The entire world, cities are growing faster. More people live in the cities and in the country than ever before. And the city has become the dominant place of human habitation. Another aspect is that the pace at which cities are growing is extremely fast. Not only are cities growing larger than ever before, there are some cities in the world that are 30 to 40 million people, or basically 10 to 20 times bigger than Chicago. These cities are growing that fast in 15 or 20 years. Okay? Almost every country in the world is an urban majority. What that means is more than half the population lives in a city. The United States has been an urban country since the 1920s. That's when it first happened. More than 50% of our population lived in cities. But for some countries in Africa, it's just happened in the last 5 or 10 years. And the last thing is that all of this growth and the majority of urban growth is happening in the poorer countries, the developing countries. So let's talk about this idea of the size of cities. I mean, there's this term called megacities. Megacities used to be considered cities over 1 million in population. They were really, really big. And in the year 1800, there were only two cities that big, London and Beijing. But in 100 years later, 1900, we had 13 cities. So that works out to about a 5.5% increase in the number of cities per year over 100 years. So 5.5% over 100 years. But look at 2015, 115 years, so a little bit longer. And now we have 400. That's a 25% increase per year. So not only have we increased faster, but just larger. In fact, there are so many megacities, 400, that now we've actually redefined it. And a megacity now is 10 million. So you kind of ramp up, right? And so in 1900, there were no megacities by that definition. In 1950, there were only two, so New York and Tokyo. And by 2015, there were 40. But again, look at that rate of increase. If we were to graph that out, right, instead of being a straight line like this, it'd be that kind of shoot like that. This just shows you right here that the percent of people living in the city in 1950, the developed countries in the world, like the United States and Germany, Italy, Japan, a little over half of the population lived in cities, 54%. That was the average. Today it's 85%. But look at this. The undeveloped countries, the countries that are poor in the world, so Nigeria, Sudan, Indonesia. In 1950, less than 20% of their population was urban, and today it's 64%. So a huge jump. And so the world in 2010 became urban, more than half. And today we're at about 67%. Sizes of cities. So again, we now have cities over 1 million people. So then now megacities have to be 10 million people. And megacities are so large that we're actually seeing an even new type. And this is, I can never say this word, metropolitanization. So instead of having large city, we have an area of cities that all kind of blur together. In other words, we have this urban region of city upon city upon city upon city. And one of the reasons we have that is with technology we discussed, with trains and cars and airplanes, people can move and drive around faster. Cities don't have to be small. In the year 1800, right, a city was only as big as you could travel by foot in one day. So in the 1800s, the furthest you can travel on foot in about 30 minutes, that's the actual size of almost all ancient cities. Today, the fastest you can go in half an hour by a train or a car is much further. Okay, so we see these regions. So here's an example. It's not so much that we have Chicago, but we have the Great Lakes metropolitan region. So there's Chicago, St. Louis, Indiana, Detroit, Columbus, Cincinnati, Louisville, Pittsburgh, Toronto, Buffalo. Basically city upon city upon city. If you go to the East Coast, from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C., it's basically one large city. In Florida, most of southern Florida, so that's Orlando, Tampa, Miami, Jacksonville. So these metropolitan regions. Another way to measure, the U.S. Census has this term called metropolitan statistical areas. And so what this is, think about Chicago. Chicago is right here. But we know there are a lot of suburbs around it that are basically connected to Chicago. People who live out in Schaumburg or Dolton or Winnetka are economically connected to the city. So they have this term called the metropolitan statistical area. You start with a city of over 50,000 people, and then you add in all the counties that are linked to it economically. So when the Census Bureau talks about the Chicago metropolitan area, they're talking about Chicago, Cook County, DuPage County, Will County, Grundy, all these counties. So this is a McHenry. This is where McHenry County, McHenry's out there. I forget the name of some of the cities. Kenosha County in Wisconsin, Lake County in Indiana, down here is where Joliet is. All this is part of the Chicago region. And what this reflects is that these areas are all heavily urban, mainly because of Chicago. It's basically an outgrowth of Chicago. If Chicago wasn't here, you wouldn't see the amount of cities you'd see here. Okay. It also shows you how cities have grown. So Chicago's population peaked in the 1950s. It was almost 3.5, maybe 3.75 million. Today we're a little over 3 million. Most cities in the United States since the 1950s have actually shrank. People have moved to the suburbs. But these maps account for that. So if you look right here, this was as of, I believe, 2000. The counties in blue were seeing growth. So the city of Chicago actually shrank in the 1990s, but all these counties, with the exception of these two, Lake and McHenry, actually shrank. And so we can also use this to look at cities around the country and see that most of the population growth in the United States has been suburban. So that's just kind of a further category. Suburban is still urban, but I think we all know the difference between living in, Chicago and maybe living in Schaumburg or in Oak Forest. So another thing about this is that it's a different geography. I know we always ask that joke, right? If you're from, a suburb of Chicago, like Naperville, are you from Chicago? And of course, we all say no because we live in the city. But if you went to, say, a trip to Tokyo, someone said, "Where are you from?" You're going to say Naperville or you're going to say Chicago, right? The reality is that this is the Chicago region. And even though this is Indiana, a different state, and this is Wisconsin, people in Kenosha and people here in Lake County, Indiana, or Porter County have more ties to Chicago, Illinois than they do in Wisconsin. And so the MSAs recognize that. This is a map of Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania. This is the boundary between Pennsylvania, over here, and New Jersey. So people who live in New Jersey, in this part, have more to do with Philadelphia than the rest of New Jersey. And people who live over here are much more connected to New York than they are to New Jersey. So this is all the New York metropolitan area. It is much larger. It shows you the reality of it. If New York wasn't as big as it was, these counties would not be as populated. There is a smaller version of this called the micropolitan, and that's just the city core is smaller. So the city is about 50,000 people. Another thing we see is this idea of urban sprawl. And I'm going to pause right here. I don't want to go too long. I'm going to pause it right here. We'll come back with urban sprawl in part 3 in just a moment.